Hello, everybody. Ni hao, and Sam and Mike, thank you very much for inviting us to participate. We very much enjoy this opportunity. Tell you a little bit about Classico Immigration Law Partners. So we're one of the largest immigration law only law firms in the world. We have 115 people only dealing with U.S. immigration, and a very big part of that is our EB-5 practice. So we were one of the first in the EB-5. My first time in China was in the very early 1990s, right after the EB-5 program started. We've had been a regular participant in working with Chinese investors for over 30 years. We've represented over 1,000 Chinese investors successfully. And we're very much involved now. Our EB-5 practice is divided into three parts. We're going to be hearing from Anu and Allison, who work with our investors. We also have a part of our practice where we put together the projects that investors invest in, working with developers and regional centers. And we also have a very well-known EB-5 litigation practice. And in fact, many of you know that my partner Dan Lundy and I co-counseled on the case that reopened the EB-5 program after the government tried to shut down all the regional centers. I personally chaired the EB-5 committee of the American Immigration Lawyers Association for 5 years. I also chaired the Best Practices Committee of IIUSA, the Regional Center Trade Group. So that's a little bit about our law firm. You see on the slide some information about me, and we very much look forward. I also definitely want to introduce Anu Nair, because you'll be hearing from Anu, and Anu is the head of, well, I guess there they are. So Anu is the person who heads up our investor team, part of the EB-5 immigration practice. Allison Lee is one of our senior associates who works both with investors and in putting together projects. Both Anu and Allison have together decades of experience working in EB-5, despite how young they are. So that's a little bit about us and about our law firm.
Allison, do you want to translate a little bit of that, and then we can get into introductions for you and Anu?
大家好，我们是 Classico 律师事务所这边有我们的管理合伙人Ron Classico， 然后呢以及另外一位合伙人Anu Nair， 他呢是我们这边EB-5投资人团队的这个管理成员那么另外还有我然后我是 Allison， 是我们律所的中文律师我们律所呢已经有非常多年的经验了，在 EB-5这个行业里面那么这个就我们很希望就是未来跟大家多多合作。
Great. Now we'll jump into the meat and talk first about source of funds and get an overview of how source of funds interacts with China, and how it's very important to really understand what types of documents and the right process for what can be expected from a Chinese investor's 526 application as it's being reviewed by USCIS. So Anu, do you want to jump in and kind of give us an overview, and then we can kind of dive into more detail as we go?
Sure, Sam. So hi, everyone. My name is Anu Nair. As Ron mentioned, I lead up our firm's investor practice. So one of the first questions that I'm generally asked when I'm doing a consultation with the client is, do I have to document my source of funds? And unfortunately, yes, it is part of the requirement that each investor has to invest their own capital. They have to prove that they own that capital. So it's not like someone else owns the money and they're investing on behalf of the investor. You also have to show how you lawfully earned the money, and then document the path of the funds from your account to the new commercial enterprise or to the project. So it's really important that we be able to document every step of the process. So when an investor is filing a 526E, which is the first step of the EB5 process, it's going to contain two parts. The first part is related to the project, and the project documents will show that it's a new commercial enterprise that was established after 1990, that based on the business plan, it is expected to create a certain number of jobs for the amount of investors that they take on, and that you do have some active role within the new commercial enterprise, and that could be something as simple as voting rights. So that's the project portion of your 526E petition. Your portion, the investor portion of the 526E petition, you have to show that you invested or in the process of investing that full amount, and as I mentioned before, how you lawfully earned that money or obtained that money, and how you were able to transfer that money and trace it all the way from your account to the project. So one of the reasons why I do like partnering with EB5 Affiliate Network is that they follow kind of the same rules that we have in place, which is I generally don't like my clients to transfer the money to the project until an attorney has had the ability to review your documents and make sure we can document it and make sure that we can show how it was obtained and show that it was transferred. Because if at the outset we learn that there may be a small amount of money that we can't document, you still have time and it's easier to fix it before you transfer the money. So the source of funds portion is the first sort of step, even before you make the investment and definitely before you file your 526E petition. So what I will go through is some of the more common sources of funds. So I'll briefly cover those, and then Allison and I will go into more detail for each of the common sources of funds. So the four major sources of funds is going to be your ordinary income that you receive either through working for a separate employer or working for a company that you've established yourself, either by yourself or with other people. So if you do work for yourself, I'll go into a little bit more detail later on the types of additional documents you will need to provide. But for both employment, you'll need to show how you earned the money and then you maintained that money. So we'll get into that in the next slide. For capital gains, this is where you want to focus on making sure that you are able to document how you initially purchased that capital or that asset, which now has appreciated in value. So it won't be sufficient just to show that your house is worth a certain amount of money now, or your stock portfolio is worth a certain amount of money now. We have to go back in time and document how you had that money. A gift or inheritance from family or friends, we would have to show how the person who's gifting the money or the person that has passed away and left that inheritance for you, how they had the money to collect the wealth that they've now passed on to you. And what we generally say is if someone's gifting you money, we want to make sure that we're providing as much documentation as if they were the primary investor. And then finally, from loans for family or friends, we want to show, and this is where you either get a private loan from an individual or a private loan from a company and not necessarily a bank. And for those, we do want to provide, where possible, a collateral, even though it's technically not required, but we do think that it makes it a little bit safer and less likely to be heavily scrutinized. And if it's a private individual, there is a possibility that the government is going to come back and ask for how they had the money and make sure that that money that they're lending you was lawfully earned. Again, we'll go into a little bit more detail for all of these, but I want to spend a little bit more time with ordinary income. So ordinary income, let's first take the option of where you are working for an employer that is independent of you. So it's not you, it's not your spouse, it's not your parents. So you're getting a salary that gets deposited into your bank account every 2 weeks or every month. And then at the end of the year, you may get a large bonus, or at the end of each quarter. Ideally, what we want to show in those situations is employment contracts or an employment letter confirming how much money you're making per year. And if your bonus structure varies each year, we do want an accounting of what your bonuses were in the last 3 to 5 years or so. And we also want to see bank accounts. Now, I don't ask my clients for 5-7 years worth of bank accounts because that's a lot of paperwork. What I usually start off by saying is give me your December bank statements or whatever month you get your bonus in, because during that month, we'll be able to see a deposit of your income and a deposit of your bonus coming in. And then if we show that month consistently for the last about 5 years or so, we'll be able to also see a steady increase in the total balance. But I'll be honest, a lot of our investors don't get rich by just keeping money in one account. Investors are very likely to move money into different accounts, different money market accounts, stock accounts. And if you do that, we do have to document that you've transferred the money from your salary account to this other account, show the accumulation in the other account, and then the consolidation back into your account before you transfer. So again, we always want to make sure that we can trace the money that you're investing back to your salary. Now, if you are self-employed, you have an additional step that you need to take. If you're self-employed, the government says your salary is no longer independent. So what they want to see is first how you had the money to establish the company. And then we need to show that the company is a legitimate business. So you need to show your certificates of incorporation, you need to show your business license, and give some proof of what the company does. So if you have sample contracts, sample invoices, sample bank statements which show the deposit of the payment coming from the sample contracts you provided. And then of course, if you are able to provide audit reports, if not, then we do need to see profit loss statements, end of year account statements. And ideally, you want to show both your tax returns and the company's tax returns. The government does indicate that you're supposed to provide 7 years of tax returns. So you want to make sure that those are available. And some investors will say they prefer not to file those tax returns at the outset and only file them if the government requests it. But as your attorneys, they want to make sure that you have that available and that the tax returns correctly match what is being listed in your 526 petition. Now, some of my investors will say, yes, I established my company in the last 3 to 5 years, so I can give you tax returns or bank statements which showed how I had money to establish this company. Others will say, I started my company in the 1990s when the banking system wasn't as robust. There's no way I can provide you any of that primary document. And that's perfectly fine. So the further back you go, the less likely it is you're going to have these tax returns and these bank statements, which will show the deposit and transfer to establish the company. And we can get creative here. So what you can do is you can maybe get an employment letter. So where did you work before you established this company? Was the money used to establish the company coming from a gift? Can we get a letter from the giftor and maybe an employment letter from them to show how they had the money that they gifted you. We've been able to include affidavits and maybe one document. So recently I worked on a case where we received a request for evidence where the government came back and said, yes, your company was established in the late 1990s, but we have nothing except your affidavit to explain how you had the money. The investor was able to find a customer from his father's previous company because his father had gifted him the money, and the customer was willing to sign a letter confirming the location of the father's company, what the father's company did, and the fact that he was a client of the father's company. And because that client's company still existed, we were able to get that letter on letterhead and then successfully defend that petition. So there are lots of creative ways to make sure that we can document the source of funds, even if the company was established over 10 years ago and you don't have that documentation. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Allison, and she'll take you through the capital gains, gift or inheritance, and the loans as a source of funds.
Hi everyone. So the second type of source of funds is capital gains, and capital gain is one of the most common sources of funds for Chinese investors, in my opinion. Usually it is derived from either sale of real estate or sale of securities such as stocks or bonds. Usually, and I would say more than 50% of the cases involve real property, and that is just because the market value in the Chinese real estate market significantly appreciate in the past, I would say, 2 decades. And in terms of documentation, like Anu just said, for source of funds, we need to trace the funds from the beginning to the end. And we need to prove that every single dollar that investor invested in the EB5 project is obtained lawfully. Usually what we need to show is, of course, first, how the investor come up with the money to purchase the assets in the first place. And one frequent concern is that if I purchased the asset many, many years ago and I no longer have the documentation to show how I obtained money to purchase the asset, what do I do? One common solution is that if the asset is purchased, say, over 10 years ago, we're able to use personal statement to explain how the investor obtained money in the first place. It's not the perfect solution, but it is a possible solution. And after we document how we obtain the money to purchase the assets in the first place, of course, we need to then provide documentation to show your ownership of the assets, and then appraisal value to show the current market value of the assets. And then if we sell the assets for the EB5 investment, then we need to provide document of the sale. And then, of course, after the investor receives the sale proceeds, how they transfer the money from China to their overseas accounts.
Maybe it would be helpful to give a little bit of that summary in Chinese as well, just in case we have some people that would do that, especially because this is the most common source of funds for Chinese investors.
Sure. 那么呢，我们这边再讲一下我刚才讲的这个关于这个资本利得，就是说呢，这个是其实在中国呢是一个最常见的资金来源解释啊。那么呢，一般来讲呢，它涉及到因为中国的房产在过去20年的时间它大幅升值那么呢，很多投资人呢会使用房产那么来作为他们资金来源的解释当然有一部分投资人因为他的投资就是说有收益，那么他们可能会通过股票的交易或者是这个债券存款等等 那么呢来作为它那个资金来源的解释那么呢很多投资人呢他最常见的一个问题问到的就是说我这个房子呢是很早买的了那么我已经没有办法就是说找回当时资金来源的文件来证明我如何购买的这一个房子那么或者这些股票那么我怎么办呢那么这个我们一个比较常见的一个办法呢，就是说如果这个房子比如说已经是超过10年以前购买的那么呢我们如果投资人实在是没有办法提供文件证明那么我们呢可以做一个就是个人声明去解释说我当时呢是怎么样比如说是因为这个工作或者是其他原因那么呢我拿到了这个购买这个房产或者是这个股票的这个钱，那么呢之后呢然后呢我因为即使10几年20年的升值那么现在呢这个资产达到了这样的市值那么呢我把它出售了以后呢就拿到了这个资本利得，那么我作为我1:5这个投资的资金来源那么呢我们这个文件上的话呢，除了刚才讲的要提供文件证明如何获得这个资产，那么呢之后呢我们当然要提供文件证明我们拥有这个资产的所有权证明，那么之后呢是这个资产的这个估值报告，以及呢之后出售资产的时候呢这个文件那么呢当然最后那就是说怎么样出售了资产以后怎么样把这个钱从中国汇到美国来。
All right, so let's move on and talk a little bit about that third category, which are probably one of the other common sources for Chinese investors, which is gifts and inheritance.
Sure, gift and inheritance. So this is a relatively straightforward, although from documentation perspective, sometimes it could be challenging. So gift is, you somebody, either usually it's a close relative, family member, give you money for your EB5 investment. So for gift, it's just providing a gift statement or a copy of the will is not enough. We still need to show how the donor or the giftor obtained the money in the first place. So in addition to a copy of the will, proof of relationship, we also need documentation to show how the donor, like I said, obtained assets or accumulate his or her wealth in the first place. And the logic is largely the same as what I just discussed earlier for the capital gain part is, of course, we have to explain what the assets are, or again, how you should accumulate his or her wealth in the first place. And then we have to show how they obtain the money to accumulate the wealth or the assets in the first place. So I think the documentation requirement is largely the same as the previous slide, except that in addition to that, we also need to provide gift statement or the will, and then proof of relationship.
All right, and let's talk about the last area, the loans, and how this works both from companies and family members. And I think for this one too, we should probably do it in both English and Chinese for those dialing in.
Okay, sure. Loans usually, technically speaking, like Anu said, pursuant to a federal court lawsuit a couple years ago, technically speaking, the loan does not have to be collateralized. But as best practice, usually we still want the loan to be collateralized, just because it's best practice, and it is easier for the immigration to approve the case. And usually for Chinese investors, the most common collateral is again real estate, real property that they own, the documentation requirement is again similar to what I just discussed in the capital gain slide, which is we need to provide documents to show how to obtain the property in the first place, and then appraisal value to show the current market value of the property. And in addition to that, we need to provide loan document to show who the lender is, and then path of funds document showing the lender dispersed the loan proceeds to the investor, and then the investor wired money from China to the US. I would say that sometimes we have to carefully review the loan document just because there are certain provisions that could cause problems. So, for example, several years ago, the USCIS started issuing RFEs saying the loan purpose in the loan agreement prohibits investment. And in that case, so we have to carefully again review the loan documents, make sure that it doesn't include such provisions. And I'm probably going to say the same thing in Chinese again. 那么另外一个资金来源的那个常见的资金来源呢，就是这个抵押担保借款啊。那么抵押担保借款呢，其实跟那个第二个我们刚才讲的这个投资所得这个资金来源的文件呢是很类似的啊。那么我们都是要先证明我们如何获得这个抵押物啊，这个抵押物。那么之后呢，我们把抵押物拿去贷款的时候呢，我们要提供这个借款方这个合同，然后呢，以及他这个当时借款方之后呢，他的放款以后，我们把钱从中国打去美国的整个银行流水啊。那么呢有的时候呢，贷款合同里面呢，我们要仔细，我们律师这边会仔细的去审核这个贷款合同，因为有的时候呢，贷款合同里面呢，它会有有一些条款，比如说它禁止这个贷款作为投资就是用作投资比如说以前有一些是这个经营性贷款那么这个时候呢，我们就要注意，那么此类贷款合同呢是不可以使用的不可以使用。
Perfect. Thank you. And now that we've covered some of those basics on source of funds, and just so everyone listening knows, it's absolutely critical that the investor gets a qualified immigration attorney involved as early as possible to determine the source of funds and work on the documentation. It can often take many months to gather the documents, have the translations and things like that. So one of the first priorities in going down the EB-5 path is getting the attorney engaged and starting on that source of funds. But the next topic is one that I think is really critical for us to focus on. We're about 1 year in since the RIA has been passed, and it created some really unique categories for Chinese investors in terms of skipping a line where a short-term solution in EB-5 hasn't been available since 2015, 2016 for Chinese investors. So now we're going to shift into what that rural set-aside means and why Chinese investors may want to consider it.
Sure. So I'm happy to discuss that with you. I assume everybody on the call is aware of the fact that over the years, there's developed a long backlog for Chinese EB-5 investors. And that backlog has at times exceeded 10 years, been up to 15 years. everybody knows about that. I'm not sure everybody knows exactly how that happened, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time first on that, and then talk about how the new law has changed that for the better. So what we need to start with is the fact that when they created the EB-5 program, they only created 10,000 visas, which includes the investor and the family member. So, you know, if you have a family of 3, for example, that's 3 of the 10,000. Well, that's not a lot of visas available every year for EB-5, considering the demand. And it gets worse because when Congress created the program, they also said that no more than 7% of the EB-5 visas can go to any one country. And since, especially in the early years, a huge percentage, up to 85 to 90% of all of the EB-5 investors were from China, the result was that it became many years until one of those 10,000 numbers and one of the 7% of the 10,000 would become available to investors from China. And that's what created what's called the oversubscription, or the quota backlog for Chinese investors. Now, the USCIS, on the next slide. So the USCIS has done a few things to both the USCIS and the Congress to address this. Number one, USCIS, the Immigration Service, has said, well, if it's going to take a long time for Chinese investors to get their green cards, there's no particular reason for us to spend our time approving the EB-5 petitions, and we're going to give priority to the EB-5 petitions filed by people from other countries where there is no waiting list. And that's almost every other country in the world. So that's one of the reasons why not only is there a long waiting list to get the green card, but why it's a long time until the Immigration Service approves the EB-5 petition. The U.S. Congress, in passing the new law called the Reform and Integrity Act in March of 2022, did something very, very good for EB-5. They did a lot of things, actually, that are very helpful. One important thing is that Congress said that you can apply not only for the EB-5 petition, but also for your green card. If you're in the U.S. in legal status, you can apply for your green card on Form I-485 at the same time while you're waiting for your EB-5 petition to be approved. So even if it takes years for the EB-5 petition to be approved, you can be legally in the U.S. As someone who's applied for adjustment of status. But that's only good if your visa is current, if you're not in a waiting list. And we're going to be talking about that in a little bit, about how Congress created a new category that allows Chinese investors to take advantage of this provision to file the I-485, remain in the U.S. while they're waiting for their EB-5 petition, but only if they do it in one of these new categories. Now, another issue that investors have is that they can't get their investment dollars back until, at least the way the law always has been, until 2 years after their conditional green card is approved. And with a waiting list, that's many, 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 many years back. So again, we want to look in a couple of slides at how Congress helped solve that problem of investors not only being able to stay in the U.S. While they're waiting for their EB-5 petition to be approved, but also to get their investment dollars back quicker if they invest in one of the categories under the new law.
And so
on
Ron,
the next slide, yeah.
Let's break that down into those two parts. So on the first part, the ability to stay in the U.S. and remain here legally, how does that play out, for a typical family from China, let's say, that has a student who's, let's say, a graduate student or an undergraduate student in college, in New York City, who, wants to stay and the family wants, wants to support that, how does that play out for that type of situation? Because that's one that we're seeing, very, very common.
So if you're in the US on an F1 student visa, and if you invest in one of the new categories we're going to be talking about, especially the rural category, then you can remain in the US as an F1. You can continue to study after you file the EB-5 petition, and you can also be able to get an employment document and a travel document. The employment document will allow you to work anywhere you want to work, even while you're going to school. And the travel document will allow you to travel in and out of the US without needing a visa. So both of those things are really important, but that only applies if you are a Chinese investor who invests in a category that does not have a waiting list. And that means one of the categories under the new law.
And so from an employment perspective, that Chinese student whose family, let's say, gifted them the funds, they made the investment, and they apply, they do the adjustment, what benefits do they have? They don't have the green card yet. They're still waiting for that, let's say, but very quickly after investment, how quickly are they going to get that work authorization travel card, and what benefits are they going to realize from that, very quickly versus other benefits from the green card, that are going to take longer for the green card to happen?
Well, unfortunately, Mike, nothing happens real quickly. And the employment benefits generally these days are taking about 6 to 9 months from the time of filing of the employment application. So if the sequence of events is I invest in a project such as a rural project for which there's no waiting list. I file the I-526E. At the same time, I file for adjustment of status on Form I-485. At the same time, I file an application for employment authorization that will probably take about 6 to 9 months to get approved. At the same time, I file an application for an advanced parole travel document that may take something like 8 to 12 months to be approved. So the Immigration Service is slow at almost everything. This is no exception. So it takes a while, but in the meantime, the student is able to continue studying, and the student has an application for conditional permanent residence pending.
Got it. And once they do get that approved, even though they don't have the green card yet, they can still have, their choice of employment. They could start a business, they could work for another company, from an employer's perspective,
absolutely.
They have flexibility.
So that gets you out of the normal scheme for an F1. The normal scheme for an F1 is you get OPT, or practical training, that allows you to work in the US in your field of study for either a year or a few years, depending on what type of OPT you have. And then after that, your future in the US is dependent upon finding a job and getting a US employer to sponsor you for an H-1B petition and going into the H-1B lottery, which this year had less than a 20% of the people selected in the lottery. So that means you have a very, very uncertain future after you're done studying and after you're done your practical training. This concurrent adjustment of status with an EB-5 petition in a high unemployment or a rural area allows you to get out of all of that and into a much more secure immigration future, because you're no longer dependent on an employer to sponsor you, and you're no longer dependent on being selected in the lottery. You put yourself in a position where you know that within a period of some months, you will be getting an employment document, and that will allow you to work without employer sponsorship and without needing to enter the H-1B lottery.
Got it. Okay, so assuming that you came from China, you've been in the US for a year or two, you love the United States, you want to make this your permanent home, basically by making an EB-5 investment, right? Assuming that, the investor hires your firm and everything checks out and the application, does eventually get approved, this is the way for them to basically never have to leave the United States once an EB5 investment's been made. Is that generally right?
Yes, what you said is correct. Yeah, that is correct, and it's a game changer. I mean, there are many good things in the new EB5 law, some not so good things, but one of the best things is that what we're just talking about, this concurrent adjustment of status, is added to the new law. It wasn't there before, and it's a big deal, but it's only available. I want to keep making sure we're clear on this. It's unfortunately not available to the investors who are still waiting in line and whose quota date has not been reached. It's only available to people who have no waiting list, either because they filed their EB5 petition many years ago, or because they filed in one of the new categories for which there is no waiting list. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to see what the visa bulletin looks like, which shows that there is a waiting list back to 2015 for investors from China. Obviously, a very, very long waiting list. So that means if you're an investor who filed an I-526 petition before September of 2015, then you can take advantage of this concurrent adjustment of status. However, if you filed after September 2015, you cannot do concurrent adjustment of status, and you have to check the visa bulletin at travel.state.gov every month to see when your date is listed, which would then enable you, if you're in the US in legal status, to apply for concurrent adjustment of status.
And so
now I want to go on the next, yeah.
Just quickly, just to walk people through this chart. So the three rows at the bottom, the 20%, the 10%, and 2%, those are the new set-aside categories created by the new EB5 law. And so as we go down those three rows, the first one, 20% set aside, 10% for high unemployment, and 2% for infrastructure. Ron, can you tell us a little bit about what those percentages mean and what the C's mean and how to interpret that as a potential investor from China?
Sure. So the RIA, the new EB5 law, said of that 10,000 visas, we're going to set aside some percentage, actually 22% of the 10,000, for people in certain categories, 32%, which is, 1 in 3 will go to people who either invest in a rural area. A rural area means an area that's outside of a big city, and there's specific definitions, but anything in a big city is not going to be a rural area. So if you invest in a rural area, 20%, 2,000 of the 10,000 numbers are only set aside for you. If you invest in a high unemployment area, and there are lots and lots and lots of high unemployment area projects, 10%, so a much smaller number, is set aside for high unemployment projects, which is a good thing, but it's not that good because A, there's more applications in the high unemployment category, and B, there's less numbers available to be set aside. And the third category, where there's really very few projects and very few set-asides, is what's called infrastructure projects, maybe building an airport or building a public works project. So those are the three categories that Congress said we're going to set aside visas for them. And we start from zero. So we're not looking at anybody who invested before the RIA. And the first person who invests in a rural project after March of 2022 is investor one in line. So that's really very significant because what it tells us is that investors who invest in rural area projects, and this is most significant for people from China, India, and to some extent Vietnam, who have the waiting list problem. So one way that a Chinese investor or an Indian investor can get out of the long waiting list is to invest in a rural project. And if we go to the next slide, we're going to look again at the fact that in the current visa bulletin of May 2023, everything says C under China and India in these new reserved categories. That means that there are still numbers available that haven't been used in those categories. And going back to what we were talking about on concurrent adjustment of status, if you have invested in a rural, high unemployment, or infrastructure project under the new law, since the quota is current, you can immediately apply for adjustment of status and employment authorization and travel document. And so that is extremely significant.
And so Ron, we talked for a minute about the advantage of that for a client, let's say, who's in the U.S. already, for one of these projects, let's say that's current, but particularly, what about the family that's all in China or all in India, and they're not going to benefit from that ability to adjust status because they're not on a status currently in the U.S. How does that family, what's their benefit from a rural project versus a non-rural project?
Sure. The benefit is that if you invest in a project such as a rural project for which there's no waiting list, as soon as the I-526E petition is approved, you can immediately begin the process of getting an immigrant visa at the U.S. consulate, presumably in Guangzhou. So let's take two examples. One is I'm an investor from China, and I decide to invest today in a project that is not in one of these set-aside categories. Well, it's reasonable to assume that I will be waiting probably well more than 10 years before I'm able to immigrate to the US. However, if I'm sitting in China and I invest in, for example, a rural project, as soon as the EB-5 petition is approved, I can immediately commence what's called the DS-260 process, the immigrant visa process, that will result in my getting an interview and my family coming to the United States as conditional permanent residents. The other thing that the new law does, only for rural projects, not for high unemployment projects, is something called priority processing of EB-5 petitions. Now, we don't know exactly what that's going to mean, but we do know that it means that Congress has said that the Immigration Service must process, must adjudicate, must decide EB-5 petitions for investors in rural areas before they decide petitions for other investors. So if I'm sitting in China, I'm saying there's two important new things for me. Even though I can't do that concurrent adjustment of status, two things are very important. One is if I invest in a rural project, I have no waiting list, and as soon as my EB-5 petition is approved, I can process my immigrant visa and come to the US and probably save more than 10 years. And two, my EB-5 petition should be decided more quickly because Congress has said it must get priority or quicker processing.
Got it. And so
that's helpful. And
go ahead, Mike.
And so we currently, obviously, many of our historical deals were high unemployment. We have a great normal high unemployment deal now as well. But to me, one of the most important things on the rural versus the high unemployment is, as you were talking about, although they both show as current today, there's 9 normal high unemployment deals for every one rural deal. So as you're thinking about applying, it's not just what shows up on this visa bulletin today. You have to make an educated guess on how many people have filed before you in each category. And knowing how many deals are normal high unemployment versus rural, you can make a pretty good educated guess that that C in the high unemployment 10% is already past that 10% set aside for current applications. So by the time you're approved, there could likely already be a waiting list. Now, we don't know how long that is, but if you're making a bet of what's more likely if you're outside of the US to stay current, the higher set aside category with fewer projects is likely that better bet.
And Ron, can you talk a little bit about, you've had a very long, storied career in the immigration space. In over your entire career, how many times have you seen the government implement, a completely new category like this and essentially create a new line that's brand new with no one in it, where new investors who happen to be in the market at the right time can really take advantage of something that is quite rare?
I would say the last time was probably before 1990, which was what, 33 years ago? Is that a good answer? So it's been a while.
Got it.
Yep.
Got it.
I think we've covered pretty much everything on this slide. Yeah, I think if I look at the slide, we've covered all of it.
Yep.
So I guess one thing that would be helpful for investors to understand, so what does rural actually mean? Because that's something, rural versus urban TEA, just like what does it mean to be rural? And can these locations still be decent investments? Like how is it defined?
Yeah, so rural is defined by geography. So the two main reserve categories, high unemployment is defined by the employment percentage at any given point in time. And of course, employment percentages change regularly. So something that is a high unemployment area today may not be a high unemployment area 2 months from now. A rural area is defined by geography, is defined by how far you are outside of what's called a metropolitan statistical area, basically how far you are outside of a city. And geography is not going to change. So if you're rural today, you will be rural in 2 months and you'll be rural in 2 years. So that's a pretty significant difference between high unemployment TEAs and rural TEAs.
Got it. Okay, one last thing before we move into the project section. I just want to just summarize that for rural projects, for investors considering an EB5 investment, a rural project investment, no matter what country you're from, I know we've spent a lot of time talking about applicability for Chinese investors, but no matter what country you're from, you're going to get the benefit of faster processing of the 526E petition, which means the green card is going to be faster. Now, if you're in a country where a backlog is potentially a problem, specifically China, India, Vietnam, then you're also going to get the benefit of the 20% visa set aside, right? And then if you're in the US already, going back to the example of the graduate student who's in the US studying in New York City, who's originally born in China, born in Vietnam, born in India, that student is going to get the benefit also of the concurrent filing and the adjustment of status. So you're going to get all three advantages. If you're in the US already, you'll get 2 of them if you're in Vietnam, China, or India, and you'll get 1 of them, the priority processing, the faster approval, regardless, of what country you're from. So that's for someone from Canada, Germany, another country where a backlog is not going to be an issue, but faster is always better than slower in terms of getting the green card and being able to start a new life in the United States.
Exactly. And as we shift gears into talking about 2 of the current rural deals that we have, our philosophy at EB5AN, it's not rural versus high unemployment TEAs. First and foremost, it is immigration safety and financial security. So although we're going to be talking about these deals that happen to be in rural areas, they meet all of our diligence criteria to make sure that we're comfortable on the immigration side of first, everyone getting their green card. So jobs already created in the project happening. And second, ensuring that we get our investors their capital back. So doing real underwriting on under construction, fully capitalized projects with a clear path to repayment. And with that, we'll transition into discussing one of our current rural deals, the Wahali project outside of Park City, Utah. So at the highest level, just to give a summary of this deal, we like this project because it's located about 20 minutes away from Park City, which is one of the leading ski destinations within the United States, with many high quality neighborhoods, ski resorts, and really a tourist destination. So the Wahali project is a residential community that's already under development. In total, it'll be about 430 homes. The capital is already in place with well over 20 million of equity already spent, a senior loan in place. And in total, this project's going to be over $400 million of construction spend. So construction is well underway with hundreds of jobs already created. And it does qualify as rural because it's right outside of the Salt Lake City metropolitan statistic area, even though it is just a short drive away from Park City. So here's some information on the land. So it's a very large project with over 5,000 acres in total, where we have a senior mortgage on a majority of the project. And the only places where we don't have a senior mortgage is where the construction loan has funded and where they have their mortgage. And as I mentioned before digging into the project, the two key areas that we look at for any EB5 project, whether it's a rural or a high unemployment TEA, is first immigration safety and second financial safety. So on the immigration safety side, we want to ensure that this project is fully capitalized and moving forward, that there's already jobs in place, and there's going to be plenty of job creation to ensure that every investor gets their green card and it becomes permanent. And historically, we have a 100% track record, and every EB5 project that we've done has been approvable and the jobs have been created. On the financial side, we want a clear path to be able to repay our investors at the end of their loan term. This is a 5-year loan term with a potential 1-year option. And we have a senior mortgage on the property and also a loan to value test and transparent quarterly reporting that we issue to all our investors so they can stay up to date on what's going on with the project. At the core of any EB5 deal is job creation, since that's what the program is built for. So this project will have 99 EB5 investors, so we'll require 990 jobs. In total, this project's going to create well over 4,000 EB5 eligible jobs, and they've already created well over 300, and at this point it may be over 400 jobs, and construction is underway. So for EB5 investors that are entering into this deal, you can be comfortable that the jobs needed have already been created and future ones are being created, and we left a very significant job creation cushion. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sam to discuss our other rural deal in Twin Lakes, Georgia, which is about an hour outside of Atlanta.
Thanks, Mike. So the second EB5 rural project that we're working on currently is a large master plan community just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, about an hour northeast from downtown. This is a large single-family home community. It's been under construction for the last several years. It's a project that focuses primarily on retirees. So you have to be 55 or up. It's an age-restricted community to buy a home. The project's been under construction for several years. All the amenities got completed recently: clubhouse, pool, walking trail, lake, etc. What's really interesting about this project is it's already profitable. So because it's been under construction for so long, it's already sold almost 500 homes. And as a result, the company that's developing the project, Coulter, that we'll talk about in a minute, has already made several large profit distributions to equity owners. Construction's well underway. There is a senior loan already in place. It's a revolving flexible senior loan with Third Coast Bank. There's already more than 1,500 EB5 eligible jobs created already. In this project, we only need 500 EB5 jobs. So day one, we already have basically triple the number of jobs needed for every one of the investors in the project. EB5 is about 6% of the total. Total project cost is almost 700 million. And this project is being developed by Coulter. They're one of the largest developers in the Southeast United States. We've been working on projects with them since 2014. This is the 14th project that we've done with Coulter. Their largest division is home building. They've built, successfully delivered over 20,000 homes. And what's most important about them is they're diversified, focused on real estate development in the Southeast United States. And they've never not completed a project ever in the last 25 years. They've never not repaid a loan. And EB5 is a tiny percentage of their total financing. Currently, the company has more than 70 projects underway. This is one of 70. So they're not at all dependent on EB5 financing. And again, we use this same approach, this immigration and financial framework, to evaluate any of our EB5 projects. And so on the immigration side, the project, again, capitalized already. We have an in-place revolving construction loan. There's almost 30 jobs already per investor. You only need 10. By the time this project's completed, we expect over 130 jobs per investor. Construction's well underway. Hundreds of homes have already been sold. The project was the most profitable, it sold the most number of homes in the Atlanta area over the last 2 years. It's already made millions of dollars in profit distributions. It's open to the public, so many of our investors have come for a visit. You can fly down to Atlanta. It's about an hour drive, see the project. We can have one of our team members meet you on site, walk you around. Coulter has 8 or 9 completed, fully furnished model homes, so you can walk through the entire process, see the quality of the construction and the approach that Coulter takes to deliver these homes. And again, Coulter is a very large company. They've been developing real estate since the 90s. The project has a 526C approval refund guarantee to facilitate an earlier return of capital if there's a denial. And again, the same transparent quarterly financial reporting that we have in all of our projects. And this is just a quick overview of the costs and the job breakdown. Again, tons and tons of jobs. One of the things that we see in the market today with other rural projects is that there's a lack of financing in place. Senior loans, may have a letter of commitment, but it hasn't actually funded, or, the financing is almost in place, but jobs haven't already started to be created. There's really no need for an investor to take that type of unnecessary risk when you could go into a project like this that is already profitable, already has all the jobs, and you can see it, go there in person, visit it, it's real, it's happening, and really just reduce your immigration and financial risk significantly with a project that's already well under development, with financing and a proven business model is really critical. Let's see.
First question that I see is Ron and team, although we can't know for sure USCIS processing times, what is your best guess based on the law of what you expect for rural versus normal high unemployment TEA I-526Es, and just what would your expectations be, obviously knowing that you can't control the government?
Sure, so I can start that. The legislation does have some language where USCIS is supposed to review the fees and potentially increase filing fees in order to hire sufficient workforce to reduce processing times down to 6 months. That is the long-term expectation. But for any client who's going into the process right now, I would not be comfortable saying you're looking at a 6-month timeline and you should get your 526 approved. I don't see that happening. I'm more comfortable saying it's probably going to be a 2 to 3+ year wait, where the rural projects will probably get that in that lower end of the range, and the non-rurals or non-set-asides will get the higher end of the range. And the other thing to keep in mind, and this is what Ron was talking about, that the big benefit into going into a project where the priority date is current, so you can immediately apply for a visa, and if you happen to be in the US or your child is in the US and they're the primary investor and can do concurrent filing, they get that work authorization and travel permit while the 526E is still being adjudicated. So short answer, probably a couple of years or more. And with the rural set aside, you're probably looking at that lower end of that range.
And how does that compare to an investor who filed, let's say not from China, but just a normal investor, let's say from Canada, before the rules changed? Is that investor, or are the new investors generally just going to be approved faster, in your opinion, or do you think it's going to be about the same as it has been before the new laws got?
So the expectation is that there is supposed to be some prioritization of the newly filed petitions, especially if they're going into these set-aside categories. But because this law is so new, it's hard for me to say definitively, yes, you're going to have a much shorter wait time. That is how it's supposed to work, but I would still expect about 2 years or more for you to get that 526E approved. I'll probably have more information once those first batches of the 526E are adjudicated, which should occur in the next year or so.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. And I know Ron and Allison, we've got a number of our colleagues in China, many of whom are agents and brokers, helping to support investors looking to pursue EB5. Can you talk a little bit about how your team works and has worked hand in hand over the years to help a lot of these partners with investors who want to come to the US but who really need that support and guidance to assemble the right documents on the ground and make that a smooth process?
Sure, I'm happy to.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Ron.
No, please.
So I was going to say we do work with a number of agents within China. Some are very well-established agents who've been doing this for a decade or more. Others are brand new agents or people who worked for other agencies and now are establishing their own agencies. So within that context, we're comfortable working with agents that have been doing this for quite some time and really don't need a lot of hand-holding from us. We'll provide them with checklists, with updates, and they're able to provide us with a fully completed source of funds packet that we then review for immigration due diligence. We also work with agents who are just starting out, and so they do require a lot more hand-holding, and we do trainings with them. They may give us a sample source of funds, a checklist of all the documents they've collected, and we can opine on that. So they don't have to spend months with the clients and then turn over the documents to an attorney only to find out it won't work. So we work with them at the outset to make sure that their strategy does work and the type of documents they're collecting will be sufficient for the government. We also work directly with investors. So some investors do prefer that even if they have an agent who's collecting their information, or maybe they prefer not to work with agents, either one, because they happen to be in the United States, so it's easier for them to communicate directly with us. We do work directly with our investors as well. And of course, because they don't have the support of an agent, we make sure that they are fully supported. We have calls with them and go over the list of documentation. We review their documents as they're collected so that they know they're on the right pathway to getting closer to the filing.
Got it. And Ron, maybe on the agent side, could you share a little bit about the new promoter form 956K and how your team interacts and helps supports agents to make sure that everything's being done correctly and filed, and there aren't any issues, since this is a new area, for everyone.
Yeah, this is brand new. One of the other things that the RIA did is it created this new concept that everybody who is involved in marketing or promoting what's called direct and third-party promoters, everyone involved in promoting an EB-5 project has to register with the Immigration Service. This is a brand new requirement. The form that you register under is called the I-956K. The Immigration Service still is working out its regulations to enforce this and its policies on this. So we don't know a lot about it yet, but I can tell you that we are working with agents to explain what the process is, to explain which employees will need to register, to explain which sub-agents may need to register. So again, it's a brand new thing, but it is certainly a service we are offering to the agents we work with to explain to them what the process is, whether they need to register, who within the agency needs to register, and assuming you work with sub-agents, to what extent they need to register.
Got it. Well, we'll do another webinar just on that topic, but I just wanted to make sure that we cover that, since that is definitely something of interest. And I guess last question. I know, Ron, you've got a busy day, but yeah, just big picture, like how would you, talking directly to a lot of agents, let's say, how would you advise them on, looking at projects, rural, non-rural, for Chinese clients specifically? What would you kind of advise them to consider, and why?
So I'd advise them to consider three or four things. Number one is the project approvable for EB-5 purposes? And there are, certainly many agents over the years that ask us to review projects before they, decide to make the projects available to their investor clients. And we do what we call EB-5 immigration due diligence on the project. Do we believe that this project should be approved by the Immigration Service? And that's issue number one. Issue number two is, if for an agent, if our investors invest in this project, what's the time frame? Because obviously a lot of investors have been unhappy with how long this process has taken. So they do want to be certain that they're advising correctly, where within a time frame that could exceed many years or more than a decade, where this fits in. Is this something, a project that if the investors invest in, they're likely to get a green card quicker or later? That's important issue number two. Important issue number three is, what is the reputation of the project developer and the regional center? You could be a regional center that's never done anything ever, and you can be a hotel developer that's never developed a hotel ever and maybe do a good job. But we always explain to agents that if you're dealing with a regional center that's done many successful projects, and you're dealing with a developer who's developed many similar successful projects, probably the odds are higher that this particular project will end up being successful. And lastly, which we don't get involved in because we are immigration lawyers, is the financial aspects. So as an investor, usually the first priority is making sure I'm going to get my green card and making sure I'm going to get both my temporary and permanent green card. But my second and also important priority is making sure I'm going to get my money back with some rate of return. And so the fourth of the four criteria that we discuss, which is not something we're expert to do, but doing the due diligence necessary to satisfy yourself that investors in this project have a good chance of getting their money back with some rate of return.
Perfect. That's great, Ron. Thank you for that. Mike, any last words to share?
No, I think this is extremely helpful. Really appreciate everyone from the Classico team taking the time to join this call. And I just say for any prospective investors or agents or advisors that are looking at this, we have a once in a 35-year opportunity, is Ron clarified, for this new Fast Pass line, which has really opened this up for Chinese investors, where for the last decade it's been shut down. So we think it's an exciting time in EB5 and look forward to answering any questions people have.
And Allison, do you want to quickly jump in Chinese and just share your contact details, WeChat, all that information for Chinese investors and agents who may want to reach out and would prefer to communicate in Chinese?
Sure. 大家好，然后again 我是 Alison， 然后是Classico 律师事务所的中文律师。您可以通过我们的网站找到我们团队所有成员的信息，包括我本人。如果您呢希望就是我们律所希望通过我们律所的帮助为您提供这个移民方面的服务的话呢，您可以在网站上找到我的这个联系方式我的名字叫 Alison Lee 谢谢。